Hi everyone, welcome to Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. This is an introduction to the Extinction Rebellion. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that where I am here is on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's land that was stolen and sovereignty's never been ceded. And also to acknowledge that First Nations people here in Australia have been in rebellion for 200 years and also struggling against extinction. Also that we meet in a time of climate and ecological emergency where what we do has great impact, and now in a pandemic emergency as well. You're tuning into this, I'm guessing you're not like these guys, trying to ignore what's happening. There are all sorts of emergencies all around us. So this is me. I thought we had 100 years. I wasn't paying any attention to the climate issue. I was a psychologist. These are my two boys when they were little, and I just thought it was in hand. It really wasn't on my radar until a psychologist, a colleague, invited me to a local neighbourhood talk, and that's where I saw the Arctic ice graph. This was 2007. It was the year that the Arctic ice just suddenly started melting really fast, and literally the scientists had been thinking that it wouldn't be gone in summer until the end of the century, but suddenly it turned exponential, and it was something about the graph that really caught my attention. But it was also, I got onto this mailing list. It was the start of a book that David Spratt and Philip Sutton were writing, and one of the things that scared me even more than the graph was hearing that climate scientists were already worrying. They were already talking about moving to Tasmania or New Zealand, and they were already afraid for their families and starting to make plans, wondering how they could stay safe. And that was in 2007. And from then I've been taking it very seriously. I did all sorts of things in the climate movement for quite a number of years. And then we realised that 2010 to 2020 is what a lot of people call the critical decade. We got halfway through that and really not much was happening. So that's when I quit my job. And now this is my day job, Extinction Rebellion. I still do a little bit of psychology. That's what I used to do. And as a psychologist, one of the things that interests me is the message. It's telling the truth. And I got so frustrated a few years ago, I actually wrote this booklet called Don't Mention the Emergency, because there still are. There are literally scientists and campaigners who are still going around saying fear doesn't work. Don't tell people how serious it is. Like, it's quite extraordinary to me, because I just think there's an absolute moral obligation to inform people exactly how serious it is, because that's when people take action. That's what we've seen with the virus. It was the stories of doctors in Italy having to decide who they were going to leave to die in the corridor because the ICU was full that made us take it really seriously and go into lockdown. Anyway, I'll be whizzing through the science without a whole lot of references, but if you want the references, they're in there. Google's up pretty easily. We go through two parts in this talk. First is the tell the truth part, telling the truth about just how bad things are. And then the second part is how we're going to act as though the truth is real. And it can be an emotional experience. I know that it's been hard for me. I've known some of this stuff for a long time now, and it does come in waves. I think the kind of feelings of shock, fear, grief, anger about the fact that nothing is happening, all sorts of feelings. But sometimes another thing that can come up in this talk is just a feeling of determination or even relief. Sometimes people say, look, I've been waiting for years for something that actually might work. I took a particular interest as a psychologist in the messaging side of the whole question, because much as groups like our local group, Darebin Climate Action Now, were trying to get out the emergency message, we were pushing against others who were saying fear doesn't work and saying you mustn't say it's an emergency, you mustn't tell people how bad it is. This became known as the doom and gloom debate. And it came to a head around an article in the New York Magazine by David Wallace Wells, which had 2 million views. It seemed to be something that people were very interested in, and it was called The Uninhabitable Earth. And within a day, there was a barrage of criticism calling this disaster porn, and again, just reiterating that you mustn't scare people. Even if it's the truth, you mustn't tell people, because people will get scared and freak out and not act. So my view was very much like David Wallace Wells when he came to his defence, that it just doesn't seem sensible to say that we're in danger of scaring, that it's more dangerous to scare people too much than to not scare them enough. Like, if people do not know it's an emergency, our chances of emergency action are zero. So I looked into the research on this, and there is a lot of research on what sort of messages work in public health, and there's not the slightest doubt that the messages that work are a personally relevant threat, this could happen to you, plus a path to address the threat. That's why we have these scary pictures all over cigarette packets, why every single public health campaign you've ever heard of has a scary message. And the other thing about this is, when it comes to actual emergencies like fire and flood, there's not even a debate. Just imagine somebody in the fire tower going, oh, it's a catastrophic fire, people really should evacuate, but we better not tell people how bad it is. I mean, really? So when it comes to emergency, there's not the slightest doubt that the best way to get people to take action is to tell them exactly what the danger is, honestly, and tell them exactly what they need to do. And all the debate that's gone on all these years in the climate movement, I think, is mainly amongst people who really don't think it's an emergency. But ever since I saw that graph, I think it's an emergency. So what we're trying to do is shift what's called the Overton window. It's the area of public debate that's seen as sensible and possible, and it's the area in which policy happens. Our opponents of action, have been very successful in shifting the Overton window right down into what should be unthinkable. This idea that scientists are lying, that it's a hoax, that the climate's always changing and there's nothing to worry about. This is what should be unthinkable, but has become normal debate. And so this is how we get things like, on Q&A, we have a climate change denier in debate with a scientist. So of course what we have to do is put a very clear, very strong message out, and that message needs to be that we are facing an emergency and that we have to take emergency action to prevent human extinction. We need to say it very clearly, we need to say it very strongly, and in that way we will shift the Overton window. The important thing to know is that the Earth is already too hot. Like, there's talk often about, can we stay under 1.5 degrees of warming, can we stay under 2 degrees? And this is part of the misleading way of describing the situation. It's not safe now. So why, there's no carbon budget. Sometimes people talk about carbon budgets. How can we have a remaining carbon budget, anything that we can safely burn, when the Earth is already too hot? One of the ways of illustrating just how extreme our situation is already is this blue bit is the whole of human civilization, the whole of organised, settled human civilization. And that's the temperature range in which all of human civilization has occurred. Here's the Industrial Revolution. It was actually heading towards slight cooling very slowly. And boom, here we are, 1.1 degrees of warming, already outside the zone in which the whole of settled human civilization has occurred. 2 degrees of warming doesn't sound like much, but look how far it is outside the safe climate zone, and 4 degrees, it's way up here. When we look around the world, we can see all sorts of consequences of this 1.1 degree of warming. And these include, of course, the melting of the polar ice sheets. Scientists didn't think the Antarctic was going to melt, but the Arctic sea ice is melting, the Antarctic ice is melting, and now, of course, Greenland is melting as well. And up in the Arctic, methane is starting to be released from the permafrost and from the melting sea, from under the ocean. And that's a very powerful greenhouse gas. With all the ice that's melting, and just with the heating as well, we've got sea level rising, we've got flooding of coastal cities, including very beautiful ones like Venice, but also all sorts of cities around the world where millions and millions of people are living. Extreme weather, we know, is increasing. This is Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. And in Australia, we've had this series of crises, massive droughts through 2018, leading to the drying up of rivers like the Darling River and the death of these beautiful 100-year-old Murray cod. Followed very quickly by once-in-a-century floods like this one in Townsville, early 2019. And then, barely without a break, straight into horrific fires that summer. One of the worst wildlife disasters in modern history, with billions of animals that died. If Australia had been a country, if the fires were a country, it would have been the 6th highest emitter in 2019. So 5 countries and then the Australian fires. That's how much carbon went up into the atmosphere as just vast tracts of Australia burned. At the moment, of course, we're dealing with the pandemic, and that's certainly hard enough. But there are other parts of the world that are dealing with all sorts of climate-related disasters and the pandemic, both at the same time. Right now, floods are affecting 1/3 of Bangladesh, 3 million people. And there's locust plagues in Africa and also in parts of Asia. Large parts of Africa are facing famine, partly related to the locusts, partly related to the other natural disasters, and trying to deal with the pandemic at the same time. And worldwide, we know that there are already 820 million people hungry. As the climate emergency worsens, there are more and more people in the situation, like this Indigenous farmer in Guatemala, whose maize crop has failed, making the difficult decision whether to try for another crop, hope that the weather is kinder, or whether to take what little is left and go on the road trying to find another place to live. There's other things that we're doing, like we're actually disrupting the ocean's currents at the moment, the currents that circulate the cold from the poles to mix with the warmth from around the equator. This is something that scientists have said is a very dangerous and concerning thing to mess with. And it's one of those things, we don't know how bad it could get, and we have no idea at all how to reverse it. Sometimes people talk about all these crises and all these terrible fires and all these floods as the new normal. Well, is it the new normal? No, of course, like we saw in that Arctic ice graph, a lot of these processes are exponential. It's not the new normal, it's possibly the start of something that's much, much worse. And that is because of feedback loops and tipping points. If you're paddling downstream and suddenly around the bend you see there's a waterfall up ahead, if you paddle for the shore, with a bit of luck you'll make it. If you've left it too late, you might be past the point of no return, and then you'll go over the waterfall. Now, in the climate, there's tipping points and points of no return as well. So at 1 degree of warming, we've already got some momentum in the system, some momentum towards further warming. At 2 degrees of warming, there'll be more momentum. If we get to 3 or 4 degrees of warming, that's when we're over the waterfall. And look, I flipped through that a bit fast. I'll just go back one. Whoops, back one. There, yes. So 3 or 4 degrees, it's like we're going over the waterfall. Somewhere around 1 to 2 degrees, we could pass the point of no return. So Hans Schellenhuber is one of the most eminent scientists in the world, founding director of the Potsdam Institute, advisor to the German Chancellor, advisor to the European Union and the Pope. His summary of our situation is that we're reaching the end game, and that very soon we have to choose between taking unprecedented action, or accepting that it's been left too late and bear the consequences. And he's one of the people who says that the issue is the very survival of our civilization. So just to illustrate a couple of these feedback loops, as the ice melts, the summer ice in the Arctic, it leaves dark ocean, which absorbs more heat. It's like the difference between a black t-shirt and a white t-shirt on a hot sunny day. As it absorbs more heat, of course, the temperatures rise, more ice melts, and round it goes. Similarly with the permafrost that I mentioned before, as the temperature rises, the permafrost melts and the methane bubbles up. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, so it contributes to further warming. Similarly, of course, with the fires. As the temperatures rise, forests dry out and burn more often and more severely. You lose the storage of carbon that those forests were providing, put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and another side effect is that less rain falls because the forests partly create the rain, and then of course there's more warming around it goes. So fire process like that, even very large rainforests like the Amazon are in danger of drying out, burning, and never growing back the same, growing back as savanna, which is not nearly as powerful a carbon sink. But the worst thing to worry about is a cascade of feedbacks where these feedbacks feed into each other. And this is what Will Steffen says in a paper with Hans Schjeldenhuber and a whole lot of others, is that even if we stay under 2 degrees of warming, we can't exclude the possibility that we trigger this cascade of feedbacks that pushes the Earth irreversibly onto a hothouse Earth pathway. Now, it's not saying that we definitely will be past the point of no return before 2 degrees. It's definitely not saying that. It's just saying that we don't know where that point is and we have to be careful. Here it is in graph form. So this is the Earth when it was stable, reasonably stable in terms of temperature and climate. We've destabilised it with the greenhouse gases we've put into the atmosphere. And now we're heading for sort of the edge of the waterfall, what's described as the planetary threshold. If we go over the waterfall, that's the point of no return. And we'll be warming 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees. We don't know how much, we don't know where it will stop. If we paddle hard, if we get to zero emissions as fast as we possibly can, there is still some chance that we can restabilise the Earth's climate and restore a safe climate. Now, of course, sadly, we're facing a climate emergency, but also an ecological emergency. And some of the damage to ecology is things like the reef that are related to warming. Some of it is the damage that we're doing via cutting down all large amounts of the forest and by messing with the ecology via the massive amount of land that we use for agriculture. Now, if we look back 10,000 years ago, we had 99% wild animals and we had about 1% humans, mammals, by weight. Now we've got 60% by weight livestock, domesticated animals. All those little dots there, that's humans on a beach. 36% by weight of the mammals are human now, and wild mammals, just 4%. From 99% to 4%. That's what we've done already. We don't want to keep on going down this path. As well as the mammals, of course, we've got already underway an insect apocalypse. So the number of insects is in dramatic decline. It's very hard to count insects, so we don't know exactly how bad it is, but we have been researching the decline in the bees, of course, central to our food system. The problem we've got is that the chemicals we use, the pesticides, the herbicides, are killing the insect life above the soil and also the life under the soil, which keeps our soil healthy and which produces food. So we've got an insect apocalypse and a soil emergency to do with how we farm. And we've begun Earth's 6th mass extinction. There's been 5, not caused by humans. Now we're just starting into the 6th, caused by humans. And sometimes people say, oh, well, if humans become extinct, what does it matter? The animals will be better off. We're beginning a mass extinction of the animals as well, the rest of nature. An important thing to bear in mind is that mass extinctions in the past required millions of years to recover. 10 million years on land for the Permian Triassic and 2 million in the oceans. David Attenborough, till quite recently, a very mild-mannered naturalist, mainly known, of course, for his beautiful nature shows, recently said to the UK Parliamentary Committee on Environmental Issues, we cannot be radical enough in dealing with the issues that face us. He's someone who has left his usual, quiet, isn't nature a beautiful position to start to speak out. This is what we all have to do. And one of the controversial things that Extinction Rebellion says is that we are actually risking human extinction as well as the mass extinction of the natural world. One of the things we know is that people are already dying. They're dying of heat. These are not deaths that are counted, like they're not counted like the virus deaths, but quietly around the world, particularly in poorer nations, but also like tens of thousands have died in some of the heat waves in Europe. They're not counted as climate deaths. Around the world, food and water shortages, well, they're caused by many things as well, but they're certainly exacerbated by what we're doing with global warming. And these are becoming more and more extreme. In India, 21 cities this year are expected to run out of groundwater. It's hard to even imagine the level of suffering that will cause. And the thing with the food and water shortages also is that they're already leading to conflict and mass migration. So this is the start of collapse, only the start, early stages. But we've got already millions of people displaced, millions, 15 million already displaced inside Africa, many inside the borders of their own countries, some across borders. And we're looking at somewhere between 200,000, possibly up to 1 billion people displaced by 2050. Like it's just impossible to imagine what that amount of people on the move trying to find a place that's safe is going to look like if we go down that path. The food and water shortages are described as a threat multiplier for conflict. So this is a picture from the Syrian war. And of course, climate is not the only reason that work happened, but it was a contribution. It was a contributing factor, a threat multiplier. So this is a quote from Guterres from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. There was a massive drought in Syria. It lasted 3 years. And 1.5 million Syrians were displaced from the farm into the urban areas. And that's one of the things that created the instability that led to the breakout of the conflict. Not the only thing, but a threat multiplier. One of the things you can see happening as well is that you've got nations building walls. Now, one of them, of course, is very well known, the American one, but there's also this one that the Indian government has built all the way around Bangladesh. It's patrolled by tens of thousands of troops. In 1 year, they shot 800 people. And if you look at this, you can see what the problem is. Bangladesh, the red areas are the low-lying areas. A whole lot of Bangladesh's food-growing area is being taken over by the sea as the sea levels rise and flooded as the extreme weather increases. This is another quote from Lonnie Thompson, paleoclimatologist. And he's saying, look, we don't speak out much as climate scientists, but we are now speaking out. This again was 2010. And the reason is that virtually all of us are now convinced that global warming poses a clear and present danger to civilization. This is a more mild-mannered way of saying the same thing. It's the sort of language, though, that makes people, well, that can easily pass people by and people not realise that this is as serious as it actually is. There is no certainty that adaptation to a 4 degrees world is possible, to a 4 degrees warmer world. The World Bank is saying there's no possibility, there's no certainty that humans can adapt to a 4 degrees warmer world. But we could be in a 4 degrees warmer world by later this century. This is a stronger way of saying something very similar. I think this is again from Hans Schellenhuber. He said that his estimate is that if we get to 4 degrees of warming, the Earth would only have a carrying capacity of about 1 billion people. Like, it's hard to even begin to imagine the pain and suffering that involves billions of people dying. And if we get to that point where billions die, then it's hard to see how human civilization survives it. The natural temptation, I think, faced with information like this is to go, well, how can I keep safe? It's like the scientists at the start. How can I keep safe? Can I get some land? You know, can we move to Tasmania? Can we find a place that's cooler, it's safer, it's away from the chaos? But someone said to me, Well, if the social order breaks down, having land in Tasmania, it's no use to you. The land in Tasmania, it'll go to the people, the biggest, strongest people with the biggest weapons, the strongest private army. Once the social order breaks down, the fact that you have a title or a rental of land, nobody cares. So this is the good news, and it's the bad news. Like, it's the bad news, but it's also the good news, because for the first time, probably in human history, there actually is an issue that unites us all. There's no doubt that, of course, it's coming first and worst to those who've done less to cause it in Asia, Africa, South America. But the climate and ecological emergency, it's coming for us as well. Even in our relatively comfortable lives in Australia, it's coming for us as well. We're all in this fragile blue planet together. How do you feel hearing this? Like, it's hard, it's really weird talking on Zoom. I can't see you properly, and I don't know how you feel. I don't know what effect it's having. But this is a chance just to share with each other your feelings about what you've heard so far. And including, like, did you know this before? If you knew it before, what's it like to know it? And to go around day to day. Well, a lot of people, don't take it that seriously, but you know that it's really bad. If you've just heard it, well, I feel sort of sorry. I feel almost like apologising, because I don't like to upset people, but yeah, it's important to know the truth. So just 1 minute each in the breakout rooms. So this is how we act as though the truth is real. It is an emergency. So we've got to act like it's an emergency. But the problem we've got is that our political and economic systems are broken. So a lot of the ways that we might think first to try and act are just not going to work. And we can tell that because the climate movement's been trying them for quite a number of years now. All sorts of things we've been trying: giant marches, giant petitions, all sorts of election campaigns. We just had what was meant to be the climate election last time, and it's just not working. And one of the ways we can see there's just emissions just keep on going up. All the IPCC meetings, all the IPCC reports, emissions are still going up. It's not working, and time's running out. And in Australia, but also in many places around the world, the problem is basically our political system's broken. We've got some companies and some individuals making massive profits from very destructive industries, of course, fossil fuel industries big in Australia. We've got people just with outrageous amounts of wealth. So much money, they can buy whole media outlets, they can massively influence elections, and they can put incredible pressure on politicians, partly by owning media outlets. And the problem then is we've got that politicians are very reluctant to rein in those destructive industries, and very reluctant to address wealth inequality. They're being leaned on from quite a number of different directions. So around you go. More and more inequality, more and more a few people with way too much influence over our system. And now, of course, we've got, out of this brokenness, the proposal for a gas-fired recovery. We've got the COVID Commission stacked full of fossil fuel industry representatives recommending that we spend billions subsidising a dirty gas-fired recovery. And how do we do anything about it? If you asked Australians, I don't know how many people would be going, yeah, let's have a gas-fired recovery. The system's broken. Our voices are not being heard. But there's still, of course, a lot of us who don't realise it's that serious, and that's partly because we're not being told the truth. Well, in fact, sometimes we're told just out-and-out lies. We've got an economy that actually is like an addict. It's dependent on endless growth. Every time the growth slows, we get all sorts of economic consequences. Politicians get voted out unless they've got growth, jobs and growth. But it doesn't actually make us happy, endlessly shopping and getting more stuff. And of course, it's destroying the planet. Plastic's just one part of that. So what are we going to do? We've tried lobbying, we've tried all the mainstream channels. Well, this is what someone who's been part of those mainstream channels, a negotiator at the Paris climate talks, Cristiana Figueres, she says, Civil disobedience is not only a moral choice, it's the most powerful way of shaping world politics. She's seen it in action, and she's now an advocate for civil disobedience. So it's time. It's time for us all to do what we can in the way of mass civil disobedience. It's something that has worked through the years, and as Martin Luther King said, when the law is unjust, that we actually all have a moral responsibility to take on those unjust laws, the unjust functioning of our Australian Parliament at the moment. It worked to bring about change with the civil rights movement in the US. It worked to bring about change, get vote for women, particularly in Britain. There was a lot of non-violent civil disobedience. Needed to push it over. When mainstream lobbying, ordinary protests had failed, it was mass civil disobedience that pushed it over the edge. And it can work even against massive forces. So this is the ordinary people of India engaging in mass civil disobedience like the salt marches led by Gandhi, who eventually managed to gain independence for India. Now, I think a lot of people have had the assumption that violence is somehow more powerful than non-violence, and this was certainly something that Maria Stephan thought. She ended up writing a book with Erica Chenoweth, and they investigated 323 movements just to work out, like, is non-violence more powerful or violence? And what they found was that non-violence wins more likely. It's more likely to win, 53% versus 26%. And the thinking that they have is that it's because people are more able and willing to participate. You get broader public support. But the other really important thing is that you're more likely to get support, or at least detections, or at least some sort of support from the police and the military. If you've got to fight the government, half of society, the police and the military, you're just not going to win. So you have to get some of them to at least hold off on treating you badly, hold off on arresting you, and certainly hold off on violence against you. But the other benefit of non-violent movements is you're more likely to have a relatively free, relatively democratic society afterwards, where with violence, you've got the violent people winning the struggle, and then the violent people running a sort of totalitarian society afterwards, or a very authoritarian society, and often also a form of organisation that doesn't last. Another really surprising thing that comes out of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's research is that you can win with a relatively small amount of the population. There wasn't a single one of these 323 movements that failed if they got more than 3.5% at a peak event. Mind you, that's a lot of people, like that's a very large peak event. So, you know, it's not to say that it's easy. But on the other hand, many of them succeeded with less than 1%, like some of them with way less than 1%. And this is against dictatorships, against massive armies. You know, these were very hard struggles. Roger Hallam, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, looked into this for his PhD as well. And his view, looking through history, is that if you can have 500 people actually in jail, 5,000 arrests, that's approximately equivalent to having 1 million people on the streets. But actually way easier to organise. This is one of the things I found most inspiring, hearing about Extinction Rebellion, because I've actually been involved in these, 13 years now that I've been working on the climate emergency. I helped organise the People's Climate March, and it just took 6 months of agony and phone calls and meetings and making stuff and getting ready. And then one afternoon it was gone, and it really had very little effect. And yet it took us 6 months to organise the thing. I think that large marches are becoming less effective. The government just goes, oh, well, bit inconvenient for the afternoon, and back to business as usual next day. There's a proud history of civil disobedience in Australia, including, of course, the famous Franklin Dam blockades, including the amazing Kimberley gas hub, 2 years of road blockades and protests that prevented the gas hub getting built in pristine country up there on Aboriginal land. And Lock the Gate, a wonderful, powerful movement in Victoria and New South Wales and across many parts of Australia. And perhaps the peak event was the Bentley blockade, with 1,000 people in a camp, 100 to 200 visitors per day. And at one point they sent 800 police to try and clear the blockade, and they couldn't do it. So the exciting thing is that I think in the same way that there are climate tipping points, there are actually social tipping points. And what this means is that there's many a movement that has gone along slowly, slow, hard, nothing happening, and then boom, just suddenly it seems to take off. And I think this is what's happening with climate. I really think things have changed in the last few years. And this is, you can see this in the school strike. Like, yeah, Greta, back in August 2018, she was one person outside the Swedish Parliament. Really, just 1 year later, 7 million on the streets in 100 countries. Same with Extinction Rebellion. Early 2018, just 15 people. And really, just over a year later, enough people to shut down London for 11 days. And now hundreds of thousands in 68 countries. It's that same exponential progress. So it's time to join the Extinction Rebellion. We need you. As I said, it began with only 15 people. It came out of a group called Rising Up that had already been experimenting with some of these confronting tactics, just slightly shocking. Things like these smoke flares, things like spray painting even quite old buildings, usually with chalk spray. But initially shocking. I can remember when I first saw, this is Roger Hallam over here, spraying, and Gail Bradbrook, this is outside the Murdoch Press in London. And I was, oh, you know, I don't like the thought of spray painting, but it's an emergency. They were pioneering these methods. And then in 2018, they formed Extinction Rebellion, had a big discussion about the name. Was it too confronting? But I think it's a great name. They started doing talks like this one, all around the UK, building to a set date. So they could say, are you willing to get arrested? Are you willing to block the streets? This is the date you need to come to London. Then they got people practicing blocking the streets in the suburb of London or in the country town, not because of trying to cause disruption so much in that place, but to practice working together, to get confidence that if you block the road that the traffic would stop, to practice working as a team. Right from the start, they put pressure on the big NGOs to support them, including the city and Greenpeace, when Greenpeace wouldn't do a call out for their rebellion. Then on the 31st of October, they told the government that if they didn't declare an emergency, that they would rebel. They put some pressure on the BBC and other news outlets to cover the rebellion. And then when the government had not acted by the 17th of November, they blocked 5 bridges with 180 arrests, 6,000 people approximately, and they launched the rebellion. They specialise in these visual, confronting, emotional actions like blood about children and like this nude protest in the Brexit debate. They were calling out, you're wasting our time, we're going to die, in the middle of the Brexit debate. And 13 people were arrested, but it was news all around the world. I heard of it driving around in my car in Melbourne. A very good use of 13 people's willingness to be arrested. Now, this was the exciting bit. In London, in April, it was started by then an international rebellion. They managed to hold 5 locations for 11 days, more than 1,000 arrests, and the government came to negotiate. They put a motion through the Parliament declaring an environment and climate emergency. And I don't think that it's not something that would ever happen without those 11 days of disruption. Sometime after that, Theresa May set a 0 by 2050 target, which is not nearly enough. But again, I don't think it's something that would have happened without the 11 days of disruption. Extinction Rebellion tries to make all our protests and our blockades family friendly. We want a very broad cross-section of the public to join us. So in just about every action, there'll be a space where families can join and obviously not get arrested. We're aiming to create inside the organisation the kind of culture that we're trying to, that we want to see in the rest of society, which is a supportive and compassionate culture. We're decentralised, and that's the only way really that it could spread so fast to 68 countries. But it's not just do whatever you feel. There is a self-organising system which guides the direction of the movement.
It's a decentralised movement, but you do need to adhere to the principles and values. And there are 10 of them, which if you come to an induction, you'll be able to hear more about these and discuss them. There'll be an online induction session soon. So that's the 10 principles and values. So you have to be pursuing the demands and you have to be doing it non-violently.
These are our 3 demands. The first one, tell the truth. Government and media, tell the truth and declare a climate and ecological emergency. We've got to move into emergency mode. This is the first thing. We're not going to get fast changes that we need unless we're in that frame of mind. Like it's the frame of mind where you're sitting around the table in normal mode and then the stove catches fire. Suddenly you're in emergency mode. Nothing matters except focusing on that fire, getting it out. Same thing in a fire or a flood or a pandemic. We're really focusing on getting that pandemic under control. And these emergencies can bring out the best in us, a desire to work together for the greater good. This is people cleaning up after the Brisbane floods, helping each other, and acting with great courage and compassion, like the healthcare workers at the moment. The second demand, net zero by 2025, plus halting biodiversity loss. Can we do it by 2025? Some people say it's unrealistic. Look, we've got to get into emergency mode. We've got to throw everything at the problem and we won't know how fast we can go until we try. So I think of it as just code for as fast as humanly possible. The Earth's already too hot. It's not like we have a carbon budget. People who say that, they're misleading you. So we need a massive change. It's a society-wide mobilisation of a speed and scale never before seen in peacetime. Even the emissions reductions we're seeing during the virus, well, they're happening for the wrong reasons, but they're also not as big as the changes we need to see. We've got to change everything simultaneously.
We've got to get to net zero, right? That can be a mixture of cutting emissions and finding ways to put emissions in the ground with things like regrowing forests, doing regenerative agriculture, biochar, that sort of thing. Once we get to net zero, we've actually got to keep going, because if we take seriously that the Earth is already too hot, obviously we've got to make it cooler, and the only way you can do that is by sucking some of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere, sticking it under the ground. And every kind of plant is just great for that. As long as we can let large parts of the world regenerate, regrow, rewild, that can take care of some of that job of drawdown. So it's no use pretending it's just a few more solar panels here and there. This is not a small transition. This is not a minor thing. What we require is a society-wide mobilisation, everybody working on this at a speed and scale never before seen in peacetime. This is just some figures on military spending, and you'll see that Germany ramped up from spending 23% of their national outlays, national income on war, to spending 70%. That was in 4 years. But USA went from 1% to 42%. So these are the kind of things you can see when it's an emergency, and you've seen it with our spending now on the pandemic. The good thing about natural drawdown, about regrowing, rewilding, is that it helps with the protecting biodiversity as well. So we can do both, all at the same time, all at emergency speed.
The third is beyond politics, citizens' assembly to decide how this emergency transition occurs, and with an insistence that the transition has to be a just transition based on climate and ecological justice. Another way of phrasing that third demand is that it's about improving democracy. What we've got now doesn't have the voices of ordinary people getting heard. Whereas citizens' assemblies, they're like jury duty. They're a form of participatory democracy. They're randomly selected. They mostly have at least 100 people in them, so you can represent the various demographics of the society. They're advised by experts, non-biased, not full of vested interest experts. and they're supported in wise deliberation and really thinking through the issue, and they mostly come up with really good results. That's because ordinary people, when you sit them down and they can apply ordinary common sense to a problem, basically just do a lot better than people who are really being pushed around by vested interests. Because even though we've got left and right and, you know, all sorts of divides in society, actually the vast number of people agree our political system is broken. The vast number of people agree you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And the vast number of people, pretty much everybody, wants to leave a place that their kids can live, a habitable planet. So based on this desire for a habitable planet, the Extinction Rebellion is spreading all around the world. South Africa, India, France, Hong Kong, all sorts of places, some large, some small, and continuing through the virus, although of course, like the main thing we do is mass action, and it's very hard during the pandemic, but we're finding ways to do it. Despite the pandemic, even through the pandemic, we have a plan, and part one of that is mass mobilisation, just setting up and supporting hundreds of local groups, eventually thousands of local groups, all through Australia, providing training in non-violent civil disobedience. It's worth going to that even if you think that you probably wouldn't want to get arrested, just to find out about the laws and about how it works and all the different roles. Even if you want to be in a non-arrestable role, it's worth going to the training. And there's all sorts of other skills, like if you want to get involved in organising, there's all sorts of training about facilitation skills and how the self-organising system works. So that's part one, mass mobilisation. Part two of the plan is basically escalating disruption. So initially local actions, then bigger actions in the state capitals, and then finally we're going to work up, hopefully quite fast, to a prolonged disruption of either one city or maybe several cities, where tens of thousands come out and block the streets for as long as we can, at least a week. Now, for all the reasons that I explained earlier, we are non-violent and there's no exceptions. So it's non-violent actions and non-violent words. So one of the things we hold quite strongly is no blaming and shaming, which is sort of weird when we say the system is broken and it's toxic and it's killing us. We say that about the system. But the thing we say is not climate criminal. We say join us. We're aiming for defections from the elite, from every branch of the toxic system. We need as many of the people who have been caught up in the toxic system to join us as possible. So we hold the toxic system accountable. Like, there's certainly no shying away from that, but we don't make individual people feel bad as best we can. You don't want to back them into a corner. They're more likely to agree to our demands if we don't blame and shame them. Part of what we're working towards is a dilemma for the government, that we're going to block the streets for a really long time, as long as we possibly can. At that point, it's a dilemma for the government. They either let us stay there, which is embarrassing, or they use excessive force to remove us. So this is on a bridge in Paris, and people have been obviously given a chance to move back if they wanted, but these people are getting pepper sprayed in the face, which is quite an excessive reaction to a very small number of people sitting on a bridge, but very powerful backfire effect. This is a tweet from Greta Thunberg about it, with 4,760,000 views. So that, again, is an action that went all around the world. So yeah, in Australia it's growing. All sorts of actions have been going on over the last year in pretty much every state and territory. This is some people from Melbourne blocking a bridge in the lead up to the October Rebellion last year. I think it's about 60 arrests there. This was a giant die-in in Burke Street after the election. Some faith groups participating in the Spring Rebellion, the Red Rebels. Lots of arrests in Melbourne and Sydney particularly, but I think also in Brisbane. And fun as well. So this is civil disobedience. We went dancing around the streets, disrupting traffic for an hour or two, but we were dancing to staying alive. It was a great event. It's since gone all around the world. Now people say, oh, you block the streets, aren't people going to get cross? Well, they do. Like, it's no doubt if people are actually stuck there while we're blocking the streets, they can get cross. But But this is at the end of a very negative article about commuters being furious in the Age. The question was, do you support the Extinction Rebellion protests? It's not a question about do you think there's a climate emergency or do you want some climate action. 84% actually support the protests. Or did. This was halfway through our week of action. And that was out of 135,000. That's age readers, of course, but still, I think that's quite extraordinary for some very disruptive tactics that we were using in that period. And we already have some results, even from our relatively small movement in Australia. In the weeks after that Spring Rebellion in October last year, 400,000 signed a petition to declare a climate emergency and sent it off to Parliament. Now, we'd been working for a year in 2016. We got 20,000 over the course of a year. Suddenly, in 3 weeks, 400,000 Australians signed a petition asking the government to declare a climate emergency. And following on from that, 3 climate emergency declaration motions. Like, you may not even have heard of this. It didn't get much news. But 2 motions went up in the House of Representatives, both narrowly defeated. I think we just needed 3 Liberals to cross the floor that would have got up, and 1 in the Senate, which was actually a draw, but that's not enough to pass in the Senate. So there's lots of ways you can help. Like, it really doesn't mean you have to get arrested, but if you have a willingness to risk arrest, like, you're the heart of the movement, we especially want you to come and help. But if you are willing to help the people who are willing to get arrested, even if it's cooking food or making badges or making flags, being a legal observer, being on Twitter, any of our social media, helping write newsletters, pamphlets, there's 1,000 things you can do. So what do you think? The first step would be to either join or start a local group in your local area, and I'll tell you more about how to do that, or to go to non-violent direct action training, and there is some coming up in Victoria quite soon. So we're still doing safe actions like this one in Goulburn about gas, very socially distanced. And there's a school strike for climate that we'll be participating in on the 25th of September. So bear in mind that it's easier protesting in Australia than in some other countries, and easier for some of us than others, even in Australia, of course. Consider that taking action with others feels good. It makes a lot of difference if you're feeling worried, to know that you're doing everything you can. Greta is calling on adults to act. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is. Scientists like Kate Marvel are calling on us to have courage. Courage more than hope. Courage being the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. We don't know how this is going to end. But this is the question I ask myself, and I want you to ask yourself as well. How do you want to be remembered? Like, people are going to know you lived through this time. How do you want to be remembered for what you did in this time? What do you want your life to be about? We're better or worse born in this period of great consequence for this generation and the ones that come after. So, if not me, who? If not now, when? Are you willing to be part of the rebellion?